I know unit tests is everyone's favorite topic. I just want to preface this one by saying this is going to be V-test and Vue specific. And it's going to be a list of my grievances over the past year while working with them. So I've done my best to channel all of my frustration constructively, and the goal is to help prevent everybody in the audience from having the same headaches that I had. Before we get started, I just want to say I'm Camille Kaniecki. I am a senior front-end engineer and the identity and orgs team at ACV Auctions. And I know there's at least one person from Cox Automotive here, but if you don't know who ACV Auctions are, we are basically transforming the dealership wholesale used car auctions, and we're digitizing it. So one of the things that I wanted to point out really quickly before we get into the talk, oh, hang on, helps if I remember my password, is the importance of accuracy. So real quick, you can see this is our live auction place for dealers. And as you can see, there's active running time countdowns, and there is currently 2,000 auctions that are live at the moment. But I wanted to show you the values of the dollar amounts real quick. One of the things we need to make sure we're doing while we're working with wholesale car auctions is that mistakes are very costly, right? If there's any sort of issue, it's not just a couple of dollars, it's going to be a lot of dollars. And so we really are prioritizing test-driven development. And as much as everyone loves unit tests, sarcasm, they are the cheapest and most readily available tests that we can implement, and we're going to have to take the time to fight through some of the problems that we're going to have. So without further ado, let's talk about a couple of the issues that I had, and then hopefully, you may run into these, you might not. But if you do, I hope it makes your life a little bit easier. So a few more quick assumptions. We're gonna assume that everybody in here is at least familiar with Vue and V-test, AKA Jest for unit testing, including concepts such as function spies, implementation mocks for API calls, and most of the V-test syntax, like describe, it, each, and so on. And if not, you can just look it up while we're talking. Everyone has a laptop. Okay, go. Really quick table of contents. So I'm going to start talking about a couple of things that are interrelated, and I did my best to separate them, but they all kind of contributed to the nightmare, which is why it's called unit test spaghetti. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Vue router and how V-test handles mock hoisting. I'm going to briefly talk about describe.each and a couple of multiple test scenarios, multiple run scenarios in a single test. We're going to talk about when we want to spy on mounted and created lifecycle hooks, mocking the window object, and then just a little bit about Vuex Gitter's initialization. I know there are alternatives available like Pina and other things like that that are going to work the same way. My examples just happen to be Vuex because that's what we have in our code base. So, you probably already know this. V-test is going to create a simulated scope. We're going to call it a wrapper to run its tests. But ultimately, it's just another JavaScript object. It's an object that contains a mounted Vue component. And as you know, objects in JavaScript are stored by reference, not by value, and this will come in handy in a moment. So V-test wrapper can contain defined mocks or stubs. We're going to simulate certain JavaScript functionality, but we don't actually have to run them or waste precious memory resources on them. And the way we do this, which you probably already know again, is we're going to call mount or shallow mount directly, and then pass it a component to mount along with some parameters. Basic stuff. Easy peasy. So why is it taking me as much time to write the unit tests as it did to finish the ticket? Sometimes I'm convinced that V-test likes to test us and not just the code. And this is part of our higher evolution as humanity. But let's take a quick look at Vue router. So Vue uses its own virtual DOM to manage its single page applications, and it has its own router to manage URL views. I would be very surprised if you haven't used it, so I'm going to just skip over that really quickly. When we're running unit tests, we don't want to import the whole router if we don't have to, because there is a ton of built-in out of the box. There's a lot of routes we have to reference and so on. This is obvious, and normally just mocking the router is enough for what we need. And this is just a quick example of how you might set this up, but normally when you're using the mount or the shallow mount method, you can mock up the route itself, specifically the router, and just put some boilerplate function method placeholders for push and replace. And normally that's all we need, right? We just want to test that the router is doing what we want, that we're loading the right things, and that we're on the right view. In normal use cases, this works great. And here's just a super simple example of something you might have seen where we have a basic SPI on the router. We just want to verify that it was called and that we're trying to go to some specific navigation. So why bother talking about it here? So here, keeping this in mind, let's present another case. And this is, unfortunately, a really quick segue. Remember, a lot of these items become difficult when we start using them in combination. So when you have, I'm sorry, I can't blow this up any larger, but when you have the same set of tests and you want to run them more than once, you have something called describe.each that you can use. And if you haven't used it yet, basically you give it an array of values and a parameter, and it'll basically run and assign the parameter each time it runs through. So the use case, which I think makes this a little bit easier to understand, is we were migrating endpoints, and we had an endpoint that used session tokens, and we had a new version of the endpoint that uses JWT. But we wanted to run the same test twice because we wanted to make sure that none of the correlating functionality would be lost if we did this. So the first time it would run through without the feature flag for the JWT endpoint enabled, and then the second time it would, or without it, and then the second time it would run through with it. So this way we don't have to duplicate the code. We don't have to have multiple test files. It was supposed to be a really easy, lazy solution to make this work. But what does this have to do with view router? So I behold to you the problem. This works fine almost all of the time, but I ran into a specific issue. And it was specifically when we added the feature flag, and then down at the bottom, we're just trying to verify that, that it has been called, sorry. Okay, no matter what I did, when I had this describe.each, the second set of tests would always fail. Now, as I said before, these are the exact same tests, and they both pass independently of each other. It didn't matter what order I wrote them in. I could have reversed the true and the false. The second set would always fail. And here's what it looked like. It's very scary. But I'll explain what's happening in a minute. But you can see the first time it goes through, it expects something and it passes. It expects the path to be auction and then some generic auction number. But what's happening after that is chaos. So here's why. And this is an actual representation of my face taken at the time of coding this. So what did I try to do to fix the problem, first of all? So I tried to clear the wrapper. The wrapper has a destroy function. I tried manually setting it to null. I tried unmocking everything, clearing all my mounts, unstubbing all my globals. No success. I even tried to set the router mock to abstract mode. So if you are using view router, most of the time you're going to use something like history or global mode, which is going to simulate your view path. So remember back in the day when everything was with hashes, when you wanted to go to a new page? You can still do that in view router, but we just don't. So we use history mode so that we can have /home/about, whatever. And it simulates the browser back button when we have a single page application. But they have another mode called abstract, which basically just loads a fresh, empty router without any knowledge of its other routes on first load. But that didn't work. It was a very sad day. So what ultimately was happening? So in the component itself, what it was doing was before the component was loading, right, before route enter, it was manipulating the URL. So the first time you would load and it would do the logic that it needed to do, it had the expected result. But the second time it did not. So why was it doing that? It's definitely that guy. Turns out that because the router was mocked, it was hoisted above the main vtest thread. So whenever you write any mock, which again is a JavaScript object, if it's inside your before each or not, if it's in a test or not, it'll actually be called before that code is run. So you can't, ultimately, once it's dirtied, you can't reset the router. It's the same instance of the router or whatever other mock you have the whole time you run the test. So in our case, it was being manipulated by the component when it was resetting the URL, but the VTest had no way of knowing or being able to restore it back to its initial state. It was trying to be sneaky and saving memory and all these other things, but in doing so, my tests were failing. So how can we get around that? And I put this in italics because I wish I had known this at the time. So it's not in my solution, but apparently it does work. If you want to give it a try, vi.domock is supposed to work the same way and isn't hoisted, but I don't know if it's actually true. So if somebody wants to test it out and let me know. Fun fact, this doesn't only happen to mocks. So this is also going to apply to things like deep copying objects. It only works on the first time you run it through. So mocks are never reallocated to memory. For example, if you run into weirdness with traversing deeply nested objects in a unit test, which is run more than once, again, this is usually described at each sort of situation. You want to use a clone deep to initialize your object in state because otherwise it just won't. It's going to try to use as little memory as possible. The documentation for VTest says that this doesn't happen, but Stack Overflow agrees with me. So I think there's some disconnect there. But either way, my unit tests refused to cooperate until I deeply cloned my objects and I started handling my mocks. So to circle back, and I'm sorry that this is circuitous, but unfortunately we only find these problems in combination, right? Anybody can do the documentation walkthrough, but it's only when we actually start implementing it that we have problems. So in general, anytime you want to run a suite of tests more than once, you should be prepared for weirdness. And then we'll circle back to our view router example for a moment. So how can we fix it? Ultimately, I was able to fix it, but I had to do a couple of things together. So I actually, and this is crazy, I had to import and use the real view router, not the mocked instance of it. We're going to use the real thing. We're also going to initialize it in that abstract mode that I mentioned. And I see a lot of people yawning. I'm sorry that this is right after lunch. I just want to let you know. I did not pick the time slot. I'll try to be more exciting. And then I set the router query and the params to an empty object. So basically, just making sure everything is initialized, clean slate. We talked about this really quick. I'm just going to recap the different roads. The different modes in view router are here, but the one that we care about is abstract because it is just a blank slate. It's an empty object. It does not simulate a real world browser. I'm just going to say this one more time. So, right, because it's in a blank state, you can set the route to be whatever you want it to. When we're mocking it, it's not actually doing that. It's initializing your full router, and it's trying to set it to a specific page. But this one is the only way that we were able to make sure it was correctly reset in between runs. So a couple other things to note. When we want to use the real view router and not a mock, we actually need to import it into our local view, and we need to pass the router itself into our mount method. And lo and behold, it passed. I feel like it didn't need to be that difficult, but here we are. So key takeaways here, again, I'm going to have a sum up at the end, but everything in VTest is going to be an object. Even the wrapper is an object, but VTest does not like to deep copy your objects. Okay, let's explore another topic. So another thing that's kind of funky about mounted or created lifecycle hooks. When we're normally spying on a function, it's normally something that a user is interacted with. But a lot of times we're going to do a render then fetch paradigm where we're going to have the component mount and we're going to pull in an API call or otherwise populate data during the fact. And we want to make sure that it's called correctly. And normally we'll just do something like this, .track. You know, this is our analytics call example, and then we say, we just listen for it. Great. But when it's in mounted or created, it doesn't work. it'll tell me that this never fires. Based on what I've said so far, anybody have a guess as to why? It's hoisted. So because it's mocked, it's going to be hoisted up above before each, and it's going to call before VTest can register that it has called. And if you actually are brave and you just put console logs in your tracking method, it will still fire. It'll just fire before VTest is aware that it's firing, and the spy will have no idea. So one of the things we can do is that we can create our spy on the wrapped component itself and not within the wrapper, which is weird, but it works. So what you can do is, in this example, hold on, I can't see into this. So I have my spy method. I declare it above the before each, and then inside I just want to call it on, my component is called analytics. So I just say analytics.methods, and then I call the name of it. And by doing it this way, because it exists above the before each, VTest keeps it in its context, and it will actually track the call. So instead of just doing wrapper.vm.track, I'm going to do analytics.methods track. And then it works. This only works for mounted or created hooks. And if you want to listen on a method which has the same name, but invoked after the mounter is wrapped. So here's a quick example. Let's say I have multiple analytics calls, and some of them are triggered by the user, and some of them are in mounted or created. What you can do is you can use this to listen to the mounted or created ones, but the user interactions that follow, you still have to use a spy that's wrapper.vm. It's a mess. I don't know why. Okay, so a couple of other just useful, I'm going to call them mocking hacks, but you may or may not agree. A lot of times, I found myself, for various reasons, mocking window native functionality. Excuse me. So the window object. If you try to test any built-in window object that you might have in your component, like window.location, window.open, in your test, it's going to throw an error that says window does not defined. Makes sense. We're not in a browser, right? But we're going to be using those functions a lot. So why does this happen? This is because VTest is tearing down the execution environment before the window object can be tested. So it spins up, it makes its snapshot, it mocks and stubs what it needs to, and then it tears down that environment. So by the time your test runs, it has no idea. It's great. How can we test it? So there is a way to test for window, and I'm just going to give a really quick look at two examples, which I think people probably use the most. So window.location and window.matchmedia. Sometimes you want to test that a user is directed to a location outside of your single-page application. But how can we listen for a spy on that method if we can't access the window object? So again, the secret lies in that everything in the wrapper, which is an object, is also at its core an object. If you take nothing away from today, it's just remembering object, shallow object, everything is an object. I need that in a t-shirt. So we can, because it's an object, we can just simply access it like we could any other property and rewrite it. And we can cheat. So what we did in this example was we just took the window object and we rewrote it to be something. We also, I don't know if I have it in this screenshot, but you can just literally say window.location, set a value, and then run your test, and it will work. It's supported by, oops, I thought I had another slide, sorry. All right, you get the idea. So window.location.href, we're just setting it normally. I just deleted it in this example. You don't have to do it. I just deleted it because I didn't want any additional window references that might just give any cross-contamination for my tests. But it's good enough to just say, it should be this, and then run your tests. The other example I wanted to talk about is window.matchmedia, which ended up opening a whole new world of window mocking for me. It's supported by all major browsers, but what we're using it for is basically just responsiveness to know when we've reached different snapshots. It returns a media query list object that can then be used to determine if a document matches the media query string. So it looks for a specific value and only fires when it matches that specific value. The difference being compared to window.resize, for example, which runs every time you move the window, match media will only run one time after it matches the window query instead of every time you're resizing the window. So it's more performant. Just a quick example of how we were using it. We were just having an event listener so that anytime we hit a specific breakpoint, we actionize on it. That's all that it's saying here. And guess what? We can mock window.matchMedia just like we mocked window.location. And so we did. So we went ahead and put in and just redeclared what everything was, and we said what the different event listeners are. We just stubbed them with basic vtest vi.fn, and then we listened for it, and it works. One more example of the window object, and this isn't specifically the window object, but we can kind of extrapolate. And I do want to apologize. This talk is not going to fill the full hour. I'm nervous, so I'm talking really fast. I apologize. A lot of times we are manipulating local storage or cookies or things like that. Things that exist within the browser, but they're not going to exist in our state when we're running our unit tests. So this is my last example, I promise, of this. We can also just basically declare local store as a bunch of objects with methods in them and have it return basically whatever we need. And it works. vtest does not distinguish the difference between the object that you declared and the object that exists in the browser, but it knows that it's firing because it's the same name. It's the same key value pair. Okay. I want to briefly, I think this is going to be the last two topics, but again, they're integrated. I want to talk about mocking API calls, which should have been two different words in my slides, and Vuex getters initialization. So because everything is an object, when you have a getter, it is also initialized as an object. In the code base that I'm going to be using as an example, we have a ton of API clients, which I'm just going to say they're references to groups of Axios instances that we just use to make our RESTful API calls. I'm just going to call it API client to be lazy. But each component has different uses for different API clients. So what we tried to do is we said, instead of making a new API client every time we want to make a call, why don't we see if we can store the API client in Vuex, and then we can just call it. And if it's initialized, great, we use it, and if it's not, we don't. And I did, and it worked great. And then I tried to write unit tests. So I just really quickly, so you could just see we imported each one of the ones that we used, we just saved them in state, and then we just tried to modify them like we would any other piece of state data. And what was happening is we were getting this error down here. So I'm sorry it's really small, but it's basically saying that it cannot find the methods in our API client that we defined. What was happening was that it was initializing, but it was only initializing the top level object, and none of the other bits and pieces that we needed were being created. And again, this goes back to everything is an object. So vtest is going to convert things like mocked implementations and classes to regular objects, so not classes, regular objects, when they are pulled from Vuex in a unit test. So it means it removes any mock implementation that you might have defined and then referenced via a getter, and it will return a mocked object and not a class. So in our example, the API client methods, they weren't being defined in the object anymore, and therefore could not have parameters assigned to them in order to make the test run. In this case, the parameters being headers and things like that. So how can we fix it? The bad news is there's no way to get around how vtest treats getters and objects. So ultimately, in this case, we ended up needing to really initialize, like we did with ViewRouter, the actual instance of the API client that we need, which goes against everything that they tell you to do for unit tests. I think the trick here is to use it sparingly in cases like this. Sometimes you have to get around the best practice, is what I'm saying. And it feels bad. It does. It feels wrong. But once you create the new client, when we actually call the spy on the client and its methods, then we get the successful test. In conclusion, and I'm just going to repeat myself so that if you take away nothing else from this talk, you take this away. Hoisting. Mocks and constants are going to be hoisted above your initialization of your wrapper in vtest. So always keep that in mind. Objects, so v-test wrapper and everything in it. They're ultimately objects and they're going to be treated as such. On multiple test run-throughs, objects are not deep copied, even though the documentation says that they are. It's not true. And state does not reset without some effort on your end. Simply destroying the wrapper is not going to do it. Order matters. The order of your unit test matters. So since the wrapper is an object, and the wrapper won't reset until you reach the bottom of your describe, your changes to state data and getters, they're dirtied from previous tests. So sometimes you have to make sure that you're running them in a particular order, unless you, alternatively, you need to do a whole new suite, which stinks. Either that, or you can do the thing where you're passing it and reinitializing it within every test. So it's up to you. I try to be efficient and squish as many that can go in order as possible, but you do what you can. And to sum up, unit tests make me cry, but I understand and appreciate the value that they bring and that they are very important. And lastly but not least, I stole these slides from Slides Go, but I like that they had noodles on them. And I hope that this spares some of you some pain once in a while. Thank you for coming, and I appreciate your time. If you have questions, great, I do too. Yes.
There's like two questions, but and they're just whatever ancillary to everything. How do you one? How do you make sure that you're not testing things that are already tested? You know, so once you get into like window object, things like that, I think sometimes you can fall into a trap of like testing something that is already JavaScript. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to test JavaScript. And the second question is, then how do you also know when is it time to, you know, bite the bullet and use the resources to just write an API? Because I also feel like sometimes, some of the things you were doing, I'm thinking about my own role, like, I feel like it's starting to get into like the edge of what I would ever want V-test to do.
Yes, I absolutely do. So we are also utilizing Playwright and EDE tests. So let me go back to your first question. So I think the answer really is just to make your components as granular as possible so that you're only testing it when you need to. Specifically, this kind of ties into both of your questions, but we have a use case just off the top of my head where we have an API that's going to return a custom registration URL for every user. And I want to verify that that one coming back is the one that's being sent over. So that one, it does make sense to do in a unit test case because we don't necessarily want to be firing that API in our end-to-end. We're still going to have it in an end-to-end. But generally, we're going to try to have anything that involves state management or UI is going to be in a unit test. We are moving away from that, and we are starting to incorporate Playwright and things like that. But again, it comes down to we're really, really hyper-focused on accuracy. And when you have the pyramid of cheapest tests, which are going to be unit tests at the bottom, and then you're going to have integration and ED up at the top, there's no reason not to. So it's more of a, we do it because we want to do it well, but we could probably let it go. So personal preference, I suppose. Does that answer both of your questions? Yeah. 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 Or I will find you. No, I'm just kidding. Are there any other questions? All right, go take a walk. I'm sorry I bored you with unit tests. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate your time.